which I know he wants to do. I'll turn it over to Lew, and then I'll be supporting Lew's talk with the slideshow here.
Well, too bad, Ed. You took up all the time. Well, thank you all for coming out. And this is going to be a little bit different than the normal things. It's just not really about me. It's places that we visited. Is this mic thing working? I'm not hearing any feedback up here. You hearing all right? Okay. At any rate, after I retired from the Air Force, I went to work for IBM. And at the time, I didn't realize that IBM stood for I've been moved. And as a result of that, we left Fairfax, came to Colorado, went to England, came back to Colorado, a couple of those things. But while we were over in England, I had the pleasure of managing some programs for the Ministry of Defense. And that gave us a few contacts, allowed me to go to a few places and do a few things that normally you don't get to do. And the last one of the sites I'll talk about, which is at Corsham, is one of the sites that is off limits, unauthorized to enter, but we'll show you that actually somebody did. But I am going to give kind of an overview of these four underground complexes: the Maginot Line, Dover Castle, the Churchill War Rooms, and then the one at Corsham. So this is just kind of a high-level overview, but I think you might find it interesting. If you're traveling through France, this is what the Maginot Line, the piece that's left, looks like on the surface. And you can see some of the turrets that are down. And it is, they do have regular tours. Now, a goodly portion of the Maginot Line has been abandoned by the French government, sold. I understand portions of it are used for wine cellars, and that also some of the French farmers that originally owned the property have actually built houses over the top of the bunkers and the gun emplacements, which provides them with an excellent basement. And when we got to the Maginot, and by the way, finding that place is not easy. You have to be on the right road, and then as you're zipping along the road, you'll see a small sign that says Maginot Line Tour Enter here. It says it in French, but that's what it means. At any rate, so we went in there. They have two different tour groups going. One speaks German, the other speaks French. Nobody speaks English, or they would not acknowledge English. We joined the group that was speaking French because the German group was about 4 times larger than the French group was. At any rate, the Maginot Line, you can kind of see that part of the country where it's at, and basically it is along the border between Germany and France. And it runs from Switzerland all the way to Belgium. And I'll get into the reasons for that as we go along here. And it was based on the French experiences of World War I, and that is a long frontal attack, static front, win by attrition. Eventually you run them out of supplies and people, and then you win. So as a result of that, they thought this line was absolute genius. But as typically things go, they change. One of the first things, they had a big conference, and they kind of decided that maybe Germany had been overpunished. The French didn't think that, but the Brits and the Americans did. And secondly, that the Germans were acting better. So as a result of that, the French withdrew their troops from Germany in 1932. They were supposed to stay till 35. And the commission that was set up to monitor Article 5 of the Treaty of Versailles, and that's the one that said Germans couldn't rearm, was disbanded. So that set the French became kind of nervous about that. And what added to their nerves was the fact that they, you can go to the next one, even though Germany lost the war, they were still a significantly larger economy than the French were, and they had more people than the French did. And the French were of the view that if the Germans decided to rearm, the United States, who's now become kind of an isolationist, wouldn't come back. The Brits didn't want to get tangled up on the continent again, and so they'd be going it alone. So their grand plan was, we'll build this line, we'll prevent a surprise attack, and they'll also protect Alsace and Lorraine, which is right behind the lines there. And they do not have to have a large standing army, because they didn't feel they could afford a large standing army. So this would force the Germans to come through Belgium in the Low Country. And the reason for the Germans to come through the Low Country was the army that the French had would then be able to hold them on that line, and the line would be in Belgium instead of being in France. And the plan was, we'll fight the war just like the First World War. Well, that didn't work out too well for them. A couple of the facilities that we have, go to the next one, Ed. Here's what some of the facilities look like today that are still up there in that park area. And one of the entrances to the underground is the entrance where we went in to the, for the tour portion. And I might add, if you get in the area of Verdun, they still have some underground facilities from that war, for World War I over there. And there's a lot of aspects of the Maginot Line that matched the ones that were over by Verdun. Go ahead, Ed. Okay, here you can see there's one of the turrets that are raised. If you saw the other picture, it was earlier. Radio rooms, some of the tunnels. Next chart. This is kind of a cross-section of it. You can see it was 7 levels deep. They had a lot of troops and so up at the top level, and then supplies, and eventually you got down to munition reserves down at the bottom. That always kind of made me nervous about. And it was serviced by train, and it was basically very good defense against any frontal attack, whether it was artillery, infantry, or air. However, that's not the way the war went. Next one. So what happened was, the Germans did as the French planned. They came through the Low Countries. However, there were 2 aspects of what the Germans did that the French weren't. One is the Germans had gone to a blitzkrieg tactic where you quickly overrun the enemy and none of this static front line business. So that was one. Secondly, the Ardennes Forest was not well defended because the terrain was so bad in the woods and the rest of it, they didn't figure any army would come through there. The Germans came through the Ardennes Forest, and they came behind the French and the British Expeditionary Force. And that's what basically forced Dunkirk. And we'll talk about Dunkirk a little bit when we get into Dover Castle, because that was the other end of that operation. So after they had circled around, it only took them about 5 days, and behind to get into France, the Germans then went on down to Paris, and they just kind of came back with a small force, and they took over part of the Maginot Line, and then the French government gave up, and so the people that were left in the Maginot Line surrendered, and that was it for the Maginot Line. Now, after the war, actually I should point out a couple other things. Do we ever learn lessons? Notice Bastogne. When the Battle of the Bulge happened, the Germans came through Ardennes Forest again, with the Allies not planning on it. Because the Allies, when we had done the D-Day invasion, we went around that area. We went around the Maginot Line and the Ardennes, expected the Germans to come back the same way. They didn't. Okay, and now after the war, as I told you, they kind of got rid of them. They kept it as a command center initially, and then after the French kicked NATO out, the French moved up above ground, took over all the NATO facilities, and so they didn't need this anymore, and they basically abandoned it, and that's when they turned it over to the city civilians. So we'll move on here now to Dover Castle. Now the Brits keep things forever. Initially, this area was a lighthouse for the Romans because it's a nice big harbor. And then after King Henry II came on, he started to build Dover Castle. And then during the Napoleonic Wars, because they're afraid the French were going to come over, they built some tunnels under the ground. One thing to know about that area, that ground is basically chalk rock, and that's kind of important as we get a little further into it. So the Brits, thinking that things were getting hot in Germany, in 1938, they started to expand those tunnels, and they made military command centers out of them. And it is Admiral Ramsay orchestrated the withdrawal from Dunkirk from this particular facility. And it was also in this general area where Patton had his ghost army later on, and the Germans expected the D-Day invasion to come through that, out of that harbor and across, because that's the shortest route into Europe. If you haven't been over there, or for those who have been over there, and you have these pictures of World War II, all these ships and everybody doing all the rest of the stuff, well, if you take the train from Waterloo Station in London to Paris, it takes you 23 minutes to go under the channel, which is faster than the airplanes were flying in World War II days. At any rate, so they converted the basically into headquarters type buildings, and they had barracks, mess halls, hospitals, and in 1940 they expanded 2 more levels below for command centers, and they also put in a full medical facility so as to be the initial treatment of the wounded. Again, World War II, the wounded were not treated very well on the battlefield, so they brought them across into there, and then they would ship them to the hospitals inland. Go ahead, Ed. This is a look at one of the tunnels. The top 2 levels are kind of open for tourists, and the tunnels in this are in good shape. They are you have to get a tour guide to go in, but they are open to tours. They had 5 levels in this complex, and they were all alpha designated A through E. The one I thought had the most interesting name was the D level, which was called Dumpy. And Dumpy stands for Deep Underground Military Position Yellow. For whatever reason. Go ahead. Since we have a good doctor in the house, this is the surgery. Was yours like that?
Looks a little crowded.
Anyhow, this was one of the surgical areas, annex, if you will. And then I go into again, next one. This is some more of the hospital layout and also some of the bunk barracks area. I look at the cots that they're sleeping on. They don't seem to be very comfortable. But are those in your camper better than that, Jerry?
Yes.
Good. Just a little bit. Okay. Okay, this is, they had the command centers type operations. You had the plotting room where they plotted all of the naval activity as well as the land activity on the continent. And followed that, this was basically a regional headquarters, if you will. Then the other side is where they plotted the inbound aircraft, because it was also anti-aircraft and intercept control points. Go ahead. And this here is, you see the radio room and the telephone exchange. Now, I might say that when I went over to England, what I was doing over there was upgrading all the Ministry of Defense fixed data and voice communication systems, which included all their telephone centers, of which they had 35 throughout the country. And 2 of them were just like that. And this is in the mid-90s.
Wow.
So I said, they like to keep things a long time. Anyhow, after the war, And as you know, the invasion did not come out of this particular area. After the war, the military kept control of it, and it was used as a regional government emergency facility, and they even had quarters there for the royalty if they needed to have a place to stay. Then they discovered in about the mid-'80s that chalk does not stop radiation. And so this was not a good nuclear bunker type situation. So they basically abandoned it for the purposes of command centers. And that's when they opened up. The other thing that happened is the British have this, what they call the Secrets Act, which is similar to all of our classified stuff. And the Secrets Act in the mid-'80s and the mid-'90s opened up so you could tell what was actually in the place, and then they opened it up for tours on the upper 2 floors. But the lower 2 floors were still off limits and classified for whatever is in there. I don't know. By the way, if you have any questions, leap in here and ask them, because I'm fairly high level moving through this stuff.
Lou, do you have access to the lower floors?
No, they did not. The only when I get to Corsham, that's the only place that we access that through special privileges. Anyhow, moving on to the next. Now we move to London. And by the way, all of these people, if you get an opportunity, and if you're traveling to Europe, I highly recommend you visit these places. They're extremely interesting, and especially to see how the individuals lived. And quite frankly, flashing back, the underground facilities from World War I that were still there reminded me of the dungeons that were at Warwick Castle. That's how bad they looked. And people were living there voluntarily. Anyhow, so this is where the Churchill's war room was, and actually it was called the cabinet room in those times, and it's just down from the regular cabinet offices. It's right in the heart of Westminster Government District. And if you're familiar with London, most of London is not in London. London itself is only about 1 square mile. It's primarily a financial district. All the government and everything else operates is outside of London. And that's what the entrance looks like, and it's the same as it was then, back during the war. Go ahead. Also, you can see a lot of this stuff on websites, but because this one is clearly set up as a museum, you don't get a virtual tour like we offer here. So you get a few shots, but you can't tour. And I forget what it costs to go in, but it's not particularly cheap. And all of the rooms are set up as they originally were set up. They have mannequins with dress of the period of time, located in key spots. Are you doing something exciting, Ed?
No, it's just something.
You can tell that the rooms are glassed in, so you can't go into the actual room. But that is Churchill's bed. Reportedly, he didn't sleep there very often. It's a twin-sized bed, and people are not altogether sure how Churchill got in and out of that thing, which is probably understandable. And this is one of the staff rooms where the staff worked. Go ahead. This is a chart room where they mapped out all the activities, both land, sea, and air, that were going on. And they gave the war cabinet, a briefing at 9 o'clock every morning relative to the status of the conflict. Here we see the war cabinet room and also the radio room. And for folks like Jim Grow that into technology, that's the level of technology they worked at the time. Go ahead. And this is the command center portion of it, or the map room. You can see all the telephones, and they had a senior officer from each of the branches of the service on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and obviously visible to the site area and the rest of it. And Their operation was not quite joint or unified like we have now. So each time something was going on, they'd have the Royal Navy, the Air Force, and the Royal Army, but you'd always have three of them together. Go ahead, Ed. Okay, this is another shot of the war cabinet room, and this difficult one to see is the secure telephone line, and this ties in the transoceanic cable, and it was through here that Churchill would talk to Roosevelt. And if you saw the movie Churchill, I believe they actually filmed that scene of him talking in this little cubby hole here. Go ahead. See if I can catch up with myself. Okay, now we move to Corsham.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
I've been there, and it's extremely interesting. But if anybody hasn't seen Churchill and Darkest Hour, those are the two movies that you see that really put this area in perspective, because both of them had shots within this.
Yes. And I might also, the movie Dunkirk, which showed the action of the withdrawal of the people from Dunkirk. And by the way, there was 338,000 men moved off of Dunkirk during that evacuation, and considering that was all basically done by the boats of private individuals. Yes, sir.
I asked someone when I saw the movie, how many of those civilian boats were? And as I recall, it was 40% of them didn't make it.
A lot of them did not.
The little boats didn't make it.
Well, they were going into the hostile area, and Germans were shooting at him. Yeah.
They didn't make it full.
Right.
forward and back.
Right.
What about the movie about breaking the German code? You know, they had a personality.
Oh, the Enigma?
Yeah, but did you ever go to the place to where they broke the code, or the computer center?
Wesley Park?
Yes.
Yeah. I've seen the machinery. I don't know if I don't think he actually went to the place, but
Can you go there?
you can visit almost any of the places. Most of that stuff now is controlled by their national history or organization. They got two different organizations that control most of the stuff. But I think it costs, like, to get into this one, I think it can cost 25 pounds or so to get into the place. It's pricey.
Is that $75 or something?
It's pricey.
No.
No, it would be about 40 or 50 bucks. It's cheaper for kids.
Senior discount? Lou?
Senior, I don't know about that. This is the underground complex at Corsham, and this one we saw a great deal more of. And if you travel from London to Bath, Bristol, or the West Country, you go through Box Tunnel. And Box Tunnel is the key tunnel to the underground. You can see the relationship of the tunnel to the underground area, which I'll show you shortly. So the trains still run through that regularly. And it's called the Great Western Line. And they talk about it going to the West Country. It takes a little getting used to their language of the West Country when you can hop in the car and just drive there in a short period of time. And I had an office at the Basel Hill Barracks, which was a co-office with the Ministry of Defense, which sits on the top of this complex. And that's how we entered into the, my contact point with the ministry was a Colonel Steve Siddle, Royal Army Colonel, and he had a friend who got him a key to unlock one of the emergency entrances. And the rest is, you'll see here. Right. Next chart. Okay, this is the layout of a portion of it, of the complex. And as you can see, you've got all sorts of things. You have bakeries, offices, VIP suite. BBC had their office there. big telephone exchanges. The initial purpose and primary purpose was for it to be munition storage. So again, we have a big underground complex loaded with munitions. Now, the mine area itself, the evacuation of this was done over the years. It was started by the Romans, quarry and mining. They cut the limestone rock out to build the city of Bath. Now, the interesting thing about this limestone, it's porous and it's wet, and it's wet, and it's soft enough you can actually cut it with a saw when it's still underground and wet. So then they would take it out, and then they would outside, and it was just like you season wood. You let it all dry out, and then you've got stone that you can now build buildings. But it does explain why, if you go ever visit Bath, why everything looks like it's got mold up and down the sides of it. And that's because it does have mold up and down the sides of it. And it really gets dirty looking quickly. Anyhow, so there was multiple mines that were built where companies were mining this. And in 1938, actually 1936. 1936, the government took all these mines over to put together this complex. Good. Now this is what the entrance to the tunnel, one end tunnel, looked like in the early 40s, and you can see one of the main tracks and one of the sidings. Everybody that worked in there was secure, classified clearances, and in order for them to keep the thing further secret, when they were bringing supplies in, or engines or so that needed to be repaired, or transferring munitions, they would bring a train in from one end to the other, and that train would pull off onto a siding inside, and another train that looked almost like it would go out the other end, properly timed, so that anybody looking from outside think it was the same train that went all the way through the tunnel, when in fact it wasn't. So it was kind of a clever operation. Go ahead. These are what the entrances look like today, which they haven't changed much. Also, you notice it did snow. Now, we were over there for 4 years. I think I saw snow twice. Twice? 3 times, maybe.
You saw it twice. I saw it once.
She came home for the holidays. And those are the tracks that you travel on today through Box Tunnel. Go ahead. This is inside, and they continued to use this also after the war. Some of the stuff was abandoned, so this is one of the rail sidings where they have their for loading, unloading, and that was some of their generator operations. And for some reason they kept the lights on. We were down there, there was lights on so we could see. It wasn't like it was totally dark. Go ahead. So these pictures were taken by us. This is what those areas look like, or similar areas during the war. And you can see the trolleys and the conveyor belts for running munitions. Go ahead, Ed. And there's a machine shop where they repaired engines, aircraft engines, some of the weapon storage areas. Again, the looks of some of the tunnels. It is really an extensive complex. Amongst other things, it does have an internal lake, freshwater lake in there in addition, which made it convenient for them.
So can you tell us how much area was actually covered by the excavator?
I have no clue. I don't.
I don't either. I'm afraid I don't know how much, but it was big, because even the small portion the portion we walked through was relatively small area.
And how deep underground was
That was this one here. I think it was 3 levels. Next chart. Actually, I have a book on the underground cities, and it shows a map of all of the different places that were located in the UK, and it does have some data on all of them. That's kind of interesting reading if you're into that type of history. This also had command centers, and this looks more like a command center. You got a balcony for the wheels to sit at, along with their assistants, and the folks doing the plotting, again, of the activities down on the lower channel here. This is an air tunnel, fan-driven air tunnel. If you can imagine being in this complex, you have steam locomotives going through there. You have fuel-driven trolleys running around. That even with air tunnels like this, the air must have been terrible down there.
Question?
Yeah.
So the photo on the left, it looks like it's mostly women.
Most of the plotters were women. In fact, a lot of the folks that worked in the command centers and other almost all the administrative jobs and jobs of that nature were women. So all the guys were off on the front or flying or whatever.
Were they part of the military?
Yes. Yeah. This is again was inside, and these are pictures which I took. Now you can see that telephone exchange was quite a bit bigger, and given the condition, it must have been used quite a bit later on, after the tunnels were no longer used by the government. The areas that were not used by the government, go ahead, tended to look like this. And there you can see one of the trolleys, there's one of the generators and an engine for the trolley, and this is one of the train platforms with a conveyor belt along the side for moving munitions.
So at what point would this complex have been sort of open for use? It must have taken a tremendous amount of time to excavate all that.
Well, as I said, most of the excavating was done by the mining companies. They did have to excavate a portion of what had been quarries, and I think somewhere I read, I think if the number doesn't escape me, it was about 96,000 tons of stone to open up one of the quarry areas so they could get into it. But they started in 1936 and then gradually made it operational. Go ahead, Ed. So another barracks type for the troops, another clinic or hospital room for the medical profession. Next chart. Now here's that unauthorized group wandering through the tunnels. And you saw the old picture of this particular one, so a couple slides back. So the gal in white would be my spouse, and then there was Colonel Siddle's wife and their 2 children. I understand that after the fact, when they found out that we had gotten in there, he got in a little bit of trouble, but I don't know how serious the trouble was. This was some of the art they had, and just to give you a comparison of the size of the pieces of art, I have quite a few of these. Go ahead, Ed. This is some more of the art. Now, Amy had made a kind of a scrapbook of the artwork, and we have it up here if you want to look through all of it. The art was done by a British artist, a noted British artist, in 1943. Her mother was British, her father was French, and she'd studied in the London art schools and came out and painted all of these murals with the help of some of the people that were in the place. After the war was over, the military kept the complex as a facility, Cold War Command Center. While we were going underneath, we could see where the walls that divided the new command center from the rest of the place were, but we could not go anywhere near them. But they were actually there. But then they had the same thing that happened in Dover. They discovered that this wet limestone doesn't prevent radiation from getting through either. So basically in the mid-'80s, they abandoned that as a command center, but they didn't abandon it. They just moved the command centers out, and they continued to use it for whatever. And as I said, in the book I have, it does address this one. It's not open for tours, and it is strictly off limits.
Is that because they're saving it just in case?
I would assume it's kind of a just in case, and that may well be a financial thing involved also. If you start bringing tourists into a place, there's a whole litany of things you got to clean up and fix up, and yeah, Amy mentioned mold and the rest of it. A lot of mold. Probably was hazardous to our health being down there.
Shorten your life.
But it was fascinating. Yes.
So were there any places in England that were safe during the Cold War?
Not really. The whole country is built on chalk and limestone. In fact, if you tour the country around, if you see these big horse symbols on the sides of mountains and stuff, typically they're just taking the dirt off the top of the limestone, and you're looking at the limestone. So yeah, it's... So I'll tell you what, Ed, let's try the language thing. So we have a little bit of time here. We'll see if how people are steeped in language. Yes, ma'am.
So I didn't realize I could ask questions during part of the way back when. If the Maginot line, I'm curious what the dimensions of that tunnel were.
Well, it was 7 layers deep, and it ran along the whole German-French border, actually all the way from Switzerland around. Unbelievable, very expensive. And that was all built basically starting in the early 30s. So they spent a lot of resource on that place. And it's named after the guy whose idea it was and who actually did the building. So this is a little thing about languages and how they want to get the languages of Europe down to a common language. And you might appreciate it, but I would suggest as you read through this that you kind of think the words out loud so that you get a feel for what they're actually doing to the language. Go ahead, Ed. So it was a 5-year project to change the alphabet just slightly. Next one. Next one, Ed.
Next. Next? Yeah, okay.
Very good.
Don't go too fast. People got to read these.
Sorry. Okay, still on.
Is this a real thing?
What?
Is this prank? Is this real?
No, as far as I know, it's a prank.
Oh, okay.
Somebody did some good work on it, though, I
Very
thought.
well done.
Go ahead, Ed. Double click. Click it once more. One more.
That's true, it's true.
Yeah, it's starting to look like German.
Next one.
It's fake. Just a little bit.
And the next one. I had to give a speech to the BT employees, and that's the first time I used this. And I'll have to say they were all but rolling in the audience because they all understood this very well. So,
You know, that's kind of scary, but if you think what people are doing with the texting and stuff to our language.
oh yeah,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's not
That's-
that unrealistic.
no, it's not. It's not. Yeah.
Have you ever presented to a bunch of English teachers? That would be.
That'd be funny.
Yeah.
They'd be completely appalled.
Horrifying.
Yeah, it might be too hard on them. Yes.
They might quit their profession.
I was stationed in Belgium, and the local people that worked for the military in Belgium, we used to ask them, the Cold War, this is cold, 30, more than 40 years ago. I asked them, aren't you worried about the Russians? Aren't you worried, you know, the atomic weapons? And they said, no, 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 we're worried about the Germans coming back.
Oh yeah.
I don't think that's the way it is today.
I'm not altogether sure.
We don't know.
A war, I can't really envision a war in Europe myself this day and age, just the way people are. But, you never can tell. And we do get locked into doing the old war type thing. We always fight the old war, and that's what kind of cost the French. They built this big, humongous facility, and it proved to be of no value whatsoever.
Lou, I went through the Churchill War Rooms a couple years ago, and one of the docents down there explained that after the end of the war in 1945, they just basically closed it up,
Yes.
and they didn't open it again for 20, 30, I forget how many years, 1970 sometime, I think.
Yeah, that's all applies under the Secrets Act, and I think the Secrets Act is something like 20 years or something, whatever. It didn't make any difference what it is. It never becomes known.
When they went back in and decided to make it a tour stop, they said that there was, in the map room, there were still pins at the end of 1945, the end of the war, the pins were where they were still on the maps. They opened drawers and they found personal belongings of the generals and politicians that were there, and who basically got up and walked out and left everything there.
Yeah, that's with a number of the complexes. They just closed the doors, and that was it. They were tired of war or tired of what was going on and wanted to move on. They just shut the doors, locked them, and protected them under the Secrets Act. Any other questions anybody has?
Lou, what I found interesting about the Maginot Line is that they couldn't afford a standing army, but they could afford to build that complex.
Well, it was maintaining the standing army, the size of the Germans. They figured the German army would be about 3 times larger than what they could afford to keep standing. So, don't fight the last war. Any other questions? Yes.
So from sort of a structural perspective, has our military changed at all? I mean, we're still gonna have places like this somewhere in the world, underground, hidden, secured.
Yeah, we do.
So in that sense, we haven't changed. And I don't know that we should. It's just a working and workable.
Right. Well, a lot of different techniques. In our particular case, we generally build them into granite, so which are low.
Why haven't we abandoned the Colorado Springs?
No.
Not abandoned, but we're not using it as much.
No, Cheyenne Mountain is still used. They have the main headquarters stuff over at Peterson now, but Cheyenne Mountain is the alternate. So if there was a conflict, Cheyenne Mountain could take over whatever they were doing at Peterson.
Would it persist with the size of the weapon?
Depends on what kind of weapon you're using. It could. You got to get a fairly direct hit to do something to Cheyenne Mountain. It would be easier to take out Strategic Command headquarters in Omaha than to take out Cheyenne Mountain, and the alternate command center in Virginia also. So yeah, we have a number of those places, and they still have underground places also, but they protect the location more than anything else. Other questions? Thank you all for coming.
Excellent.
And I was short.
You were short.
And interesting.
Oh, did I luck out?